Elena Hartwell stood in her glass-walled office on the 40th floor, champagne flute in hand, watching the janitor far below move methodically across the marble lobby. The company gala buzzed behind her, full of executives eager to impress. Investors, hungry for access, all of them so terribly predictable. She turned to face the crowd, her red dress catching the light like a flame, and raised her glass with a smile sharp enough to cut. "Beat me in chess and I'll marry you," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. The crowd erupted in laughter, toasting her audacity, her brilliance, her untouchable nature. Far below, the janitor paused for just a heartbeat, his mop hovering above the floor, before continuing his work in steady, silent strokes. Elena Hartwell had no idea that the man she'd just mocked was Magnus Foster, once the youngest grandmaster in American chess history. A legend who had vanished 5 years ago, after losing everything that mattered. She couldn't know that her careless challenge would set in motion something neither strategy nor money could predict. A game where the stakes were far higher than a title or a fortune, where two broken souls would find in each other the rarest move of all. The courage to begin again. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Elena Hartwell's empire rose from ashes and spite, each floor of the gleaming tower a monument to what ambition could build when fueled by betrayal. At 32, she commanded Hartwell Technologies with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general. Her name whispered in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. The corner office suited her, all glass and steel and impossible views, a throne room suspended between earth and sky where she could watch the world below and feel nothing. Her father had taught her that lesson well. Though not in the way he'd intended, Richard Hartwell had used her mother's inheritance to build his first company, filling their home with promises and their bank account with lies, before disappearing one Tuesday morning when Elena was 16, leaving behind only debt and a note that said some people were meant for greatness and others were meant to serve it. Her mother had withered after that, dying 2 years later of what the doctors called heart failure. But Elena knew was simply a heart that had failed to protect itself. She'd learned then that love was a liability, trust a fool's currency. And the only person who would never abandon you was the one staring back from the mirror. She'd worked 3 jobs through college, slept 4 hours a night through business school, and spent the next decade systematically buying back every piece of the company her father had sold, until the name Hartwell meant her. Only her. A self-made fortress no one could breach. The office reflected her perfectly. Beautiful and cold, decorated with awards she never looked at, and art she'd bought because advisors said she should. Late evening had become her favorite time. When the building emptied and she could finally drop the mask, pour herself a drink, and stare out at the city lights like stars she'd never reach. That was when she first noticed him, the night janitor who moved through the floors below with a strange, careful grace. He was older than the others, late 30s perhaps, with dark hair graying at the temples and a way of working that suggested meditation more than labor. While other custodians chatted and laughed, he worked in silence, his movements economical and precise, as if each task deserved his full attention. She found herself watching him more than she cared to admit, this quiet man who straightened chairs and wiped down conference tables as though the work itself mattered, as though he was exactly where he meant to be. The man Elena Hartwell watched had once been someone else entirely, someone the world had celebrated and then mourned, and finally forgotten. James Carter was a name purchased from a desperate man in Cleveland, a legal identity built on paperwork and cash. But the soul inhabiting it belonged to Magnus Foster, and Magnus Foster was supposed to be dead, or at least gone enough that it made no difference. 5 years ago, he'd been the youngest grandmaster in American chess history, a prodigy who'd learned the game at 4 and mastered it by 14, who'd competed in Moscow and Singapore and Reykjavik, who'd given interviews about pattern recognition and strategic thinking, while his wife Sarah smiled from the audience and his daughter Lily colored in her notebook, drawing castles and knights. The accident happened on a Tuesday, black ice on a highway outside Philadelphia. A semi-truck that couldn't stop, and Magnus had been 7,000 miles away studying an endgame position when his phone rang with news that turned his world into something unrecognizable. He'd flown home to silence, to a funeral where people said things like, "God's plan" and "so sorry for your loss," their words meaningless as static, and he'd stood at the cemetery watching two coffins lowered into frozen ground and felt something inside him shatter so completely that no amount of time could ever make it whole. The chess world had given him space at first, sent condolences and flowers, waited for him to return. But Magnus Foster never came back from that cemetery. He'd walked away from everything, the titles and tournaments and endorsements, changed his name in a county clerk's office, and found work that required nothing but his hands and time. Janitorial work was perfect because it demanded no decisions, no strategy, no brilliance, just repetitive motion that kept his mind blank and his memories at a distance. He mopped floors at night because the darkness felt appropriate, because he didn't have to see people's faces or answer their questions or pretend he was anything other than empty. He hadn't touched a chess piece since Lily's funeral, couldn't even look at a board without seeing her small fingers pushing pawns across their kitchen table, asking why the horsey moved in an L shape, laughing when he'd make his king run away in mock terror. Elena Hartwell's challenge had cut through his careful numbness like a blade finding the one unguarded spot. "Beat me in chess and I'll marry you." The words had echoed in his head all night as he mopped the 40th floor. Each stroke of the mop, a metronome counting the years since he'd cared about anything, since he'd allowed himself to feel anything but the dull ache of loss that had become his only companion in the hollow spaces where his family used to be. By Monday morning, Elena's champagne-soaked declaration had spread through Hartwell Technologies like wildfire, transformed from a moment of bitter humor into corporate legend. The company messaging app exploded with jokes and memes, employees treating it as the entertainment of the season, a reality show starring their untouchable CEO. 3 junior executives had already approached her assistant Margaret requesting formal chess matches, each one convinced they possessed the combination of skill and charm to succeed where others feared to try. Elena accepted every challenge with a smile that never reached her eyes, setting up matches in her glass office where the entire floor could watch. Because if they wanted a spectacle, she'd give them one they'd never forget. The first challenger, a Harvard MBA named Trevor who'd made VP by 28, lasted 11 minutes before his king lay exposed and helpless, his confident smirk replaced by stammering excuses. The second, a woman from acquisitions who'd played competitively in college, managed 19 minutes before Elena's queen carved through her defenses like a scalpel through silk. The third didn't even make it to the middle game, resigning when he saw the trap she'd built 5 moves deep, its jaws already closing around his position. Elena had learned chess from her grandfather during the last good year before her father left. Those Sunday afternoons in his study, the only memories of childhood that didn't taste like ash. Her grandfather had been a regional champion in his youth, a man who taught her that chess was about seeing what others couldn't, about recognizing that every person was predictable once you understood their patterns, their weaknesses, their tells. She'd spent years studying the game. Not for competition, but for the same reason she'd studied business strategy and negotiation theory, because power came from understanding systems and exploiting them before others realized what was happening. Each victory over her eager challengers confirmed what she'd always known: that she was surrounded by people who thought themselves clever, but were merely mediocre, ambitious, but ultimately transparent, each one playing the same tired gambits she could counter in her sleep. The wins left her feeling more alone than before, standing in her glass tower watching them slink away defeated, knowing that not one of them had seen her. Really seen her. They'd only seen the prize she represented. The trophy wife of a CEO. The ultimate networking opportunity wrapped in a wedding band. The janitor continued his work through it all, invisible to the executives who rushed past him to their chess appointments, unnoticed by the crowds that gathered to watch Elena dismantle another opponent. But Elena noticed him, found her eyes drifting to wherever he was working, drawn to something she couldn't quite name. There was a stillness to him that unsettled her, a dignity in the way he moved that seemed wrong for someone pushing a mop cart. as if he was performing a role rather than living it. He never looked up at her glass office during the matches, never paused to watch the spectacle like the others, just continued his methodical work with a focus that suggested he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere she couldn't follow, and that mystery gnawed at her in ways she didn't understand and couldn't ignore. The building felt different after 9 at night. The fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft glow, the constant hum of ambition replaced by silence that pressed against the windows like something alive. Elena had sent her assistant home hours ago, claiming she needed to review the quarterly projections alone. But the truth was, she preferred the emptiness, the honesty of a space designed for hundreds that now held only her and the ghosts of all the victories that hadn't made her any less hollow. She walked the 40th floor in her stockinged feet, heels abandoned under her desk, passing darkened offices and empty conference rooms until she found him in the largest one, the room where her board had humiliated another challenger that afternoon. The expensive chess set still sat on the table, hand-carved ebony and ivory pieces her grandfather would have loved, left carelessly arranged in the final position of defeat. James moved around it with the same careful attention she'd observed from above, wiping down the mahogany surface without disturbing the pieces, his movements precise and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, or perhaps as if time had stopped mattering years ago. Elena found herself speaking before she'd decided to, her voice startling in the quiet. "Do you play?" He stopped, his cloth hovering over the table, and for a moment she thought he might not answer at all, might simply continue his work as if she were another piece of furniture in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured, carrying weight she couldn't identify. "I used to." Something in those 3 words made her pause, made the mocking response she'd prepared die on her tongue, because there was loss in his voice, an echo of something that had once been important and was now deliberately forgotten. She recovered quickly, slipping back into the armor of sarcasm that had protected her for so long. "I'm accepting challenges," she said, gesturing to the board, with a smile designed to cut. "Everyone seems to think they can beat me. You're welcome to try." She expected him to decline politely, to mumble something about not being good enough, to recognize the gulf between a CEO and a janitor and retreat to his proper place. Instead, he looked at her for the first time, really looked at her, and his eyes were gray and infinitely sad, and somehow saw right through the performance she'd been giving for years. "Not tonight," he said simply, and began gathering his cleaning supplies. The refusal hit her like a slap, unexpected and sharp, because no one refused Elena Hartwell. No one turned down an invitation she'd offered, no matter how mocking the delivery. She stood frozen as he moved toward the door, and that's when she noticed his hands. Really noticed them. The way they gripped the mop handle with controlled strength, steady and precise, in the hands of a surgeon or a pianist or someone who'd once done something requiring extraordinary skill. They were wrong for a janitor somehow, too careful, too deliberate. And as he disappeared into the hallway, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity about another person, a question she couldn't answer with money or power or the strategic thinking that had built her empire, just a simple mystery that followed her back to her office and kept her awake long after she should have been asleep. Elena stared at the quarterly reports on her screen, the numbers blurring into meaningless shapes as her mind drifted somewhere she rarely allowed it to go, back to the cramped apartment where everything had ended and nothing had ever been the same. She was 16 again, standing in the kitchen of their once beautiful home, now emptied of everything valuable, her mother sitting at the table holding a note written in her father's confident handwriting. "Some people are meant for greatness, and others are meant to serve it." Richard Hartwell had always had a way with words, using them like lockpicks to open doors that should have stayed closed, and he'd opened her mother's heart and her trust fund with equal ease. He'd built Hartwell Technologies with Catherine's inheritance. Every brick of the foundation purchased with money that had been meant to keep them safe, and he'd played the part of devoted husband and father so convincingly that even Elena, sharp and skeptical even then, had believed the performance. The Tuesday he left, he'd taken everything, liquidated accounts, sold the company to a competitor, disappeared with a secretary 20 years younger and several $1 million that had never really been his. Her mother had tried to hold things together, working retail jobs that paid nothing, smiling through the humiliation of former friends who crossed the street to avoid her. But something fundamental had broken inside Catherine Hartwell that Tuesday morning, and 2 years later her heart had simply stopped, worn out from carrying grief too heavy for one person to bear. Elena had been 18, alone at the funeral, watching them lower her mother into the ground and making promises to the silent earth. She would never be weak like that, never give anyone the power to destroy her, never mistake love for anything other than the weapon it truly was. She'd worked 3 jobs through college, slept in her car when rent was due, lived on coffee and spite, fueled by a rage so pure it could have powered cities. Business school had been a chess game she'd already won before arriving. Every case study a puzzle she solved, while her classmates still struggled to understand the question, and she'd graduated top of her class with job offers she'd turned down because she had her own plans, her own revenge to execute. It had taken her 10 years to buy back Hartwell Technologies piece by piece, tracking down every division her father had sold, negotiating with the holding companies and private equity firms that had carved up his empire, paying premium prices because owning it mattered more than profit. The day she'd signed the final acquisition papers, becoming sole owner of the company that bore her name, she'd driven to the cemetery and stood at her mother's grave, wanting to feel triumph, wanting to feel vindicated, but feeling only the same emptiness that had lived inside her since she was 16. The romantic relationships she'd attempted over the years had all followed the same trajectory. Initial attraction giving way to frustration when her partners realized she would never fully let them in, that there was a locked room in her heart where no one was permitted entry. A venture capitalist named David had lasted 6 months before telling her that loving her was like loving a beautiful statue, admiring but ultimately unsatisfying. A professor from MIT had made it 8 months before, saying she treated their relationship like a merger negotiation, always calculating return on investment. The last one, a software designer named Marcus, had proposed after a year together, and she'd said yes because it seemed like the logical next step. But 3 months later, he'd returned the ring, saying he couldn't marry someone who'd never truly chosen him, who went through the motions of intimacy without ever risking her actual heart. She'd told herself she didn't care, that success was enough, that the empire she'd built was worth more than the messy vulnerability of letting someone matter. But late at night in her glass tower, she sometimes wondered what it would feel like to trust someone completely, to lower the fortress walls and let another person see the scared 16-year-old girl who still lived inside her, who still heard her father's words echoing in every empty room, who still believed that everyone eventually left, and love was just another con she was too smart to fall for again. Elena told herself she wasn't watching him, that her attention simply happened to fall where he was working, a coincidence of timing and proximity rather than deliberate observation. But somewhere around the 3rd week she stopped pretending and accepted that the janitor had become the most interesting part of her carefully controlled days. The other custodians moved through the building in pairs or groups, their laughter echoing through empty corridors, sharing stories about their families and weekend plans, treating the work as something to get through rather than something that mattered. James worked alone, always, moving through his tasks with a silence that felt intentional rather than antisocial, as if he'd chosen solitude the way other people chose company, as if noise and conversation required an energy he no longer possessed or perhaps had decided not to spend. She noticed small things, details that shouldn't have meant anything but somehow did. On Tuesday night, she watched from her office as he helped a young programmer named Sarah, barely 23, and struggling under the weight of moving boxes, her face exhausted from another 18-hour day debugging code. James had been mopping the lobby, had seen her fumbling with her keys and the boxes, and without a word had simply taken half her load and carried it to her car in the parking garage, refusing her stammered thanks with a gentle shake of his head before returning to his work as if nothing had happened. Thursday evening, walking to a late meeting, Elena passed him in the executive hallway where he was straightening a crooked picture frame, a photograph of the company's founding that had hung slightly askew for months. something everyone, including her, had seen and ignored because it wasn't important enough to matter. He adjusted it with careful precision, stepping back to check the alignment. His face serious, as if this small act of care deserved his full attention, as if making things right mattered even when no one was watching. There was a gentleness to everything he did that felt foreign in Elena's world of aggressive negotiations and calculated power plays, where kindness was a strategy and compassion was weakness disguised as virtue signaling. The people she dealt with daily spoke in bullets and bottom lines, measured worth in metrics and market share, treated human beings as resources to be optimized or obstacles to be eliminated. James moved through that world like he belonged to a different species entirely, one that still believed small kindnesses mattered, that dignity wasn't determined by salary or status, that how you treated the invisible people said more about you than how you treated the powerful. Late Wednesday night, working past midnight on an acquisition that was hemorrhaging money, Elena went to the break room for coffee and found him sitting alone at one of the small tables, his cleaning cart parked by the door. He was holding something in his hands, staring at it with an intensity that made her pause in the doorway, and she saw it was a photograph, creased and worn from handling, showing a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with dark curls, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. The look on James's face in that unguarded moment was so raw, so full of profound sadness and longing, that Elena felt like she was witnessing something sacred and private, something she had no right to see. He must have sensed her presence because he looked up suddenly, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met before he quickly tucked the photograph back into his wallet, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd performed this ritual of remembering and hiding 1,000 times before. She mumbled something about needing coffee and retreated. But the image of his face haunted her for days afterward, that glimpse of grief so deep it had carved canyons into his soul, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to love someone so much that losing them left you working night shifts alone, carrying their memory in your wallet like a wound that never healed. The board meeting had stretched past 9 in the evening, 2 hours of her executives presenting projections so flawed a business school freshman could have spotted the errors, their confident voices masking incompetence so profound. Elena wondered how they managed to dress themselves each morning. She'd listened to Bradley from finance explain why they should invest in a blockchain startup that had already filed for bankruptcy, watched Jennifer from operations present a supply chain strategy that would have collapsed within a quarter, endured Thomas from marketing pitch a rebrand that would alienate their entire customer base, and somewhere around hour 3, her carefully maintained composure had finally shattered. "Get out," she'd said, her voice cutting through Bradley's stammering excuses like a blade through butter. "All of you. Get out of my sight before I start calculating how much your collective incompetence has cost this company and send you bills for the difference." They'd fled like children dismissed from the principal's office, leaving behind scattered papers and half-empty coffee cups and the debris of their inadequacy, and Elena had stood at the head of the conference table, feeling the familiar rage that powered her through moments like this, the fury that kept her sharp and isolated and utterly alone. James entered 10 minutes later, his cleaning cart rolling quietly across the carpet, and the sight of him moving through the wreckage of her meeting triggered something sharp and mean inside her. She gestured at the mess with a hand that trembled slightly. "This is what I deal with every day," she said, her voice harsh. "People who have everything, opportunities, and education and resources most people will never see, and they treat it all like garbage, like it doesn't matter, like success just happens without effort or care." He'd been gathering coffee cups, moving with his usual methodical grace. But at her words, he stopped and looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't deference or fear, but something closer to pity. "Maybe they don't know what it's like to lose everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Maybe they've never had to." The words hit her like a physical blow, cutting through her anger to something raw underneath, and she found herself staring at him, really seeing him for the first time beyond the uniform and the mystery, seeing someone who understood loss in ways her executives never would, in ways she herself might understand if she was honest enough to admit it. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say. And the words felt foreign in her mouth because Elena Hartwell never apologized. Not to subordinates, not to equals, not to anyone. I shouldn't have taken my frustration out on you. He nodded slowly, accepting the apology without making it smaller or larger than it was. And in the silence that followed, Elena felt something shift, some wall inside her developing a crack she hadn't authorized. You said you used to play chess, she said, the question coming out softer than she'd intended. Would you play me? Not as a challenge or a joke, just a game. He was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse again. Watched emotions move across his face like weather, pain and hesitation and something that might have been longing. One game, he finally said, but not in your office, not where everyone can watch. Just us, just the game. She felt her heart beat faster, though she couldn't have explained why a simple chess match suddenly felt like standing on the edge of something vast and unmapped. Saturday morning, she said. The cafeteria. Before anyone else arrives. He nodded once, then returned to his cleaning. And Elena left the conference room feeling like she'd just agreed to something far more significant than moving pieces across a board, like she'd taken the first step toward a country she'd spent her entire adult life avoiding, where the rules she knew so well no longer applied, and the only map was trust she wasn't sure she remembered how to read. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in fog. The city still sleeping, as Elena drove to Hartwell Technologies in jeans and a sweater, clothing so foreign to her work wardrobe that she'd stood in her closet for 10 minutes, trying to remember the last time she'd dressed like a normal person rather than a carefully constructed monument to success. The building felt different in the early light. Softer somehow, the glass and steel transformed by dawn into something almost welcoming, and she found James already waiting in the cafeteria, a chess set laid out on a corner table near windows that overlooked the awakening city. The set itself stopped her mid-step, an old wooden board worn smooth by countless games, the pieces hand-carved and showing their age, nicks and scratches that spoke of decades of use, of being loved rather than merely owned. It was nothing like the expensive ebony and ivory set in her conference room, nothing like the pristine tournament boards she'd seen in shops, and somehow that made it more real, more honest, a tool that had been used for its purpose rather than displayed for its beauty. They sat without speaking, and Elena moved first. Her standard opening, controlled and conservative, the same beginning she'd used to dismantle every challenger who'd sat across from her. James responded with a quiet knight development, his fingers lingering on the piece for just a moment, and she noticed his hand trembled slightly, as if touching the wood cost him something she couldn't measure. The first 10 moves unfolded in silence, and Elena felt her confidence building as she executed her planned strategy, controlling the center, developing her pieces with efficient precision, setting up the patterns that had won her dozens of games. Then James moved his bishop, a quiet shift to a diagonal she'd left unguarded. And something in the position changed, some fundamental balance tipping in a direction she hadn't anticipated. She studied the board more carefully, searching for the threat, and realized with growing unease that there was no immediate danger, nothing she could point to and counter, just a subtle improvement in his position that suggested he was seeing possibilities several moves deeper than she'd calculated. The next hour passed in concentration so intense, Elena forgot where she was, forgot the empty cafeteria and the morning light, forgot everything except the board and the slow, terrible realization that she was playing someone who understood chess in ways she'd never imagined. James didn't just move pieces. He orchestrated them, creating harmonies and tensions that built toward conclusions she couldn't see until they'd already arrived, and each time she thought she'd found solid ground, he'd shift something small, and her position would crumble like sand. His moves came slowly, painfully, as if each decision required him to dig through layers of grief to remember skills he deliberately buried, and she could see in his face that playing hurt him somehow, that returning to this language was costing him more than she understood. 2 hours in, she realized she was losing, not slowly or gracefully but spectacularly. Her pieces tangled in complications of his creation, her king exposed, her plans shattered against defenses she hadn't known existed. 3 hours after they'd begun, she resigned. tipping her king over with a hand that shook from exhaustion and humiliation, and something else entirely, something bright and fierce that she slowly recognized as excitement. She'd lost, been destroyed really, dismantled by someone who played chess the way poets wrote or musicians performed, with a mastery so complete it transcended technique and became art, and for the first time in years she felt genuinely challenged, genuinely alive, faced with proof that she wasn't the smartest person in every room, that there were depths she hadn't reached and might never reach no matter how hard she studied. "Again," she said, looking up at him with fierce determination. "Next Saturday, same time. I want a rematch." James was carefully placing the pieces back in their starting positions, his movements gentle, almost reverent, and when he looked at her, his gray eyes were sad and knowing, and something else she couldn't quite name. "If we keep playing," he said quietly, "things will change." She didn't understand the warning, didn't know what things he meant or how a chess game could change anything beyond her pride and her Saturday mornings. But she nodded anyway, agreeing to something she couldn't define. Stepping further into territory she'd spent her whole life avoiding, following a map drawn by a man who'd lost everything, and somehow that loss had taught him to see patterns she was only beginning to recognize. In chess, and perhaps in everything else that mattered, the Saturdays began to stack like treasured cards, each one a small eternity contained within 3 or 4 hours of silence, broken only by the soft click of wooden pieces and occasional words that carried more weight than entire conversations Elena had endured during the week. She studied between their games with an obsession that surprised her, ordering chess books that arrived in stacks at her penthouse, staying up past midnight working through classic matches by players with names like Kasparov and Fischer and Tal, analyzing positions until her eyes burned and her mind swam with variations. She approached chess the way she'd once approached business school, determined to master it through sheer force of will and intelligence, but the game resisted her efforts in ways that were both frustrating and strangely exhilarating, revealing depths that couldn't be conquered by study alone, requiring intuition and creativity she'd spent years suppressing. James arrived each Saturday with the same worn board, setting it up with hands that shook less each week, as if playing was slowly returning circulation to limbs gone numb from disuse. She beat him once in their 4th game, a victory he'd allowed by making an uncharacteristic error in the endgame, and when she'd called him on it, he'd smiled faintly and said she'd earned the confidence boost. The smile had lasted only a moment, but it had transformed his face, letting her glimpse the person he'd been before grief had carved him hollow. Their conversations happened in the spaces between moves, measured and careful, 2 people circling each other's wounds without quite touching them. She learned he was a widower during their 6th game. The information offered quietly when she'd asked why he worked nights, and he'd said simply that he preferred being awake when other people slept, that the darkness felt more honest somehow. He learned she'd never had a real family during their 8th game, when he'd asked about her weekend plans beyond their matches, and she'd laughed, a sound without humor, and said she didn't have anywhere else to be, anyone else waiting. Neither of them pushed for more, content to let the revelations arrive in their own time, understanding that some truths needed to be approached slowly, like wild animals that might bolt if startled. The changes in Elena were subtle at first, noticed only by people who'd known her long enough to recognize that the small shifts in her demeanor represented tectonic movements beneath the surface. She snapped less frequently at incompetent presentations, occasionally asked about her assistant Margaret's grandchildren rather than simply issuing orders, once smiled at a junior analyst's joke during a meeting in a way that made the entire room fall silent in shock. Margaret, who'd worked for Elena for 7 years and weathered her moods with patient grace, finally dared to comment on a Wednesday afternoon when she brought in the afternoon coffee. "You seem happier lately," she said carefully, setting the cup on Elena's desk beside a stack of chess theory books that definitely hadn't been there a month ago. Elena deflected automatically, claiming it was just satisfaction with the quarterly earnings. But Margaret's knowing look suggested she'd connected the chess books to the Saturday mornings. Her boss now arrived late, casually dressed, with an expression that looked almost peaceful. The older woman didn't push, just squeezed Elena's shoulder gently before leaving, a small gesture of affection that Elena pretended not to need but thought about for hours afterward. The games themselves became the anchor of Elena's week, the fixed point around which everything else revolved, and she found herself watching the clock on Fridays with anticipation she hadn't felt since childhood. Christmases, back when her father was still pretending and her mother was still alive, and happiness had seemed like something permanent rather than a trick of light. She looked forward to Saturday mornings the way other people looked forward to vacations or celebrations. That mix of excitement and contentment that came from knowing something good was waiting, something real and earned, and entirely her own. She'd stopped telling herself she was just trying to beat James at chess, stopped pretending this was about competition or pride, and admitted in the private hours before dawn that what she anticipated most was simply being in his presence. Sitting across from someone who saw her clearly and didn't want anything from her except the game itself, who treated her like a person rather than a position, who'd somehow become necessary in ways she didn't fully understand and wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Elena stared at the private investigator's preliminary report on her tablet, the words blurring together as guilt and curiosity waged war in her chest, two competing imperatives she couldn't reconcile. No matter how many times she told herself this was reasonable, just basic due diligence for someone she was spending time with, just sensible caution from a woman who'd learned the hard way that people were never quite what they seemed. She'd hired Marcus Chen 3 days after their 9th game, reached out to the discreet firm her company used for background checks on acquisition targets, and told herself she was being smart rather than intrusive, protective rather than invasive. The report had arrived that morning, disappointingly thin for something that had cost her $3,000. James Carter existed on paper, a valid social security number, a clean driving record, tax returns filed on time, a rental agreement for a modest apartment in Queens, employment history as a custodian at various buildings around the city. But before 5 years ago, nothing. As if James Carter had simply materialized fully formed in a Cleveland courthouse, where he'd legally changed his name from something the investigator hadn't yet identified. The investigator's notes were cautious but suggestive. Subject appears to have assumed new identity approximately 5 years ago. Original name unknown, pending deeper research. No criminal record under current identity. Suggest authorization for enhanced background check to determine previous identity and reason for name change. Elena closed the tablet and pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling the weight of what she was doing settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. This was a violation, she knew that. An invasion of privacy that betrayed the fragile trust building between them over Saturday mornings and wooden chess pieces. But the mystery of him had become unbearable. This man who played like a master and worked like a ghost and carried photographs of the dead with such tender grief. She authorized the enhanced background check with a few quick taps, then immediately wanted to take it back, caught between the hunger to understand him and the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Across town, in a cubicle on Hartwell Technologies' 23rd floor, Daniel Park was experiencing his own moment of recognition, though his motives were considerably less conflicted than his CEO's. Daniel was 26, ambitious to the point of ruthlessness, and still bitter about Elena crushing him in chess during week 2 of her public challenge, a humiliation he'd been seeking to avenge through increasingly desperate attempts to catch her attention and prove his value. He'd been working late on a presentation, procrastinating really, scrolling through chess videos on his phone, when he'd glanced up and seen through the glass wall of the conference room that Elena and the janitor were playing again. Their Saturday ritual apparently extended to a Thursday evening session. Daniel had watched idly, noting with irritation how focused Elena seemed, how different she looked, playing this nobody compared to how she'd looked, destroying Daniel's Sicilian defense, and then the janitor had moved his knight, a quiet shift to an unusual square, and something in Daniel's memory sparked with recognition. He'd seen that move before. That specific knight maneuver in that specific position. Have seen it in a famous game he'd studied years ago, when he'd been obsessed with chess before business school had redirected his ambitions. Daniel pulled up his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, searching through chess databases and archived tournament games, chasing the memory of that distinctive night move, and when the game finally loaded on his screen, his heart began to race with the realization that he'd stumbled onto something significant, something that could change his position in the company if he played it correctly. The signature move belonged to Magnus Foster, the American grandmaster who'd vanished 5 years ago after a tragedy Daniel vaguely remembered reading about. And as Daniel began comparing photographs of the young chess prodigy to the middle-aged janitor mopping floors 40 stories below, the similarities emerged slowly but undeniably. The same eyes, the same sharp cheekbones softened by age and grief, the same hands that had once moved pieces in front of thousands, now moving them only for an audience of one. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating angles and approaches, ways to leverage this discovery into the promotion he deserved, completely unaware that he was about to detonate something far more explosive than he could imagine, that the secret he'd uncovered wasn't just about a janitor's hidden past, but about the fragile connection between two broken people who'd finally found something worth protecting, something that could be destroyed by exposure as easily as a king caught in checkmate with nowhere left to run. The crisis hit on a Tuesday afternoon like a heart attack. Sudden and devastating, Elena's phone lighting up with calls from 3 board members simultaneously, while her CFO burst into her office with news that Tech Dynamics, their largest client, was threatening to pull a $100 million contract that represented 12% of their annual revenue. A competitor had undercut their bid by 20%, offering terms so aggressive they had to be bleeding money. But Tech Dynamics didn't care about their vendors' profit margins, only their own bottom line, and they'd given Hartwell Technologies 48 hours to match the offer or watch the contract walk. Elena spent the rest of the day running numbers that didn't work, building proposals that sacrificed margin for survival, and by evening she'd booked a red-eye to Singapore, where Tech Dynamics' CEO was attending a conference, her only chance to negotiate face-to-face before the deadline expired, and took a significant piece of her company with it. She worked through the night preparing, survived the 14-hour flight on coffee and adrenaline, and somewhere over the Pacific Ocean realized with a jolt that Saturday was 3 days away, that she'd missed their game. Their ritual that had become as necessary to her as breathing. She found James on Thursday evening, her bags already packed in her office, the car waiting to take her to the airport. He was cleaning the executive kitchen. And when she told him she had to leave, had to miss Saturday, she saw something flicker in his gray eyes that looked like disappointment, maybe even hurt, emotions he quickly buried beneath his usual careful neutrality. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she said, hating how much she wanted him to ask her to stay, to acknowledge that these games mattered to him the way they'd come to matter to her. On impulse, before she could talk herself out of it, she pulled out her phone. "This is my personal number," she said, scribbling it on a piece of paper with hands that trembled slightly. "In case you need anything, or if you just want to talk." He took the paper carefully, like it was something fragile, and nodded once, and Elena left before she could do something foolish like admit that the thought of missing Saturday felt worse than potentially losing a $100 million contract. Singapore was brutal. Negotiations conducted in glass conference rooms, 40 stories above the city, Tech Dynamics' CEO playing hardball, while Elena countered with arguments about quality and reliability and long-term partnerships, all the business school rhetoric that sounded hollow when the other side only cared about quarterly earnings. The meetings stretched 12 hours each day, her team working around the clock to revise proposals and run scenarios, and by the second night Elena stood in her hotel room at 3 a.m, too exhausted to sleep and too wired to rest, staring out at cherry blossom trees in the garden below, their pale petals ghostly in the landscape lighting. She found herself pulling out her phone, opening a new message to James's number, typing before she could overthink it. "There are cherry blossoms outside my window. I've never really noticed them before. How beautiful they are at night." She sent it without expectation, assuming he'd be asleep, but her phone buzzed 30 seconds later. "I taught my daughter about cherry blossoms once. She wanted to know why they were special. I told her it was because they don't last long, that their beauty is tied to how temporary it is. She said that seemed sad. I said it made them precious." Elena stared at the message, reading it 3 times, tears unexpectedly burning her eyes at the image of James with his daughter, teaching her about impermanence and beauty, about loss, disguised as a lesson about flowers. She thought about responding, but didn't know what to say, how to tell him that his words had cracked something open inside her, so she just sent back a simple thank you and stood at the window until dawn broke over Singapore, and it was time to put her armor back on and return to the negotiations that would determine her company's fate. The contract was saved on Friday afternoon, Elena agreeing to terms that sacrificed short-term profit for long-term stability, a compromise that would satisfy the board and keep Tech Dynamics happy, a victory by any objective measure. Her team celebrated with champagne she didn't drink, congratulating her on her brilliance and her toughness, and Elena smiled and accepted their praise while feeling absolutely nothing, the win as hollow as every other win she'd achieved alone. She flew home that night, arrived Saturday morning, exhausted and jet-lagged, and the first thing she did was text James asking if it was too late to play their game. And when he responded saying he'd meet her at the cafeteria in an hour, the relief she felt was so profound it scared her. This realization that somewhere along the way, a weekly chess game with a janitor had become more important than saving a $100 million contract, that the person she most wanted to share her victory with was someone who'd never cared about her money or her success, who only cared about the moves they made across a worn wooden board in the quiet hours before the world woke up. Elena walked into her office Monday morning, still carrying the lightness from Saturday's game. The memory of 3 hours spent across from James' trading moves and occasional words, but the feeling evaporated the moment she saw Daniel Park standing beside her desk, practically vibrating with nervous energy, a tablet clutched in his hands like a winning lottery ticket. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice pitched high with excitement, "I need to show you something important. Something about your janitor friend." The presumption in his tone, the eagerness in his eyes, made her stomach clench with foreboding. But she set down her briefcase and gestured for him to continue, watching as he pulled up video files and documents with the flourish of someone convinced he was about to be richly rewarded. "This is from the World Chess Championship in 2019, he said, turning the tablet toward her, showing footage of a tournament hall filled with spectators, 2 players seated at a board on a raised stage. "That's Magnus Foster, the youngest American grandmaster in history. He was ranked number 4 in the world." Elena stared at the screen, at the young man moving pieces with confident precision, and her breath caught because even allowing for 5 years and grief and deliberate obscurity, the face was unmistakable, the same gray eyes and sharp cheekbones, the same careful hands now worn by labor instead of celebrity. Daniel was scrolling through more evidence. Newspaper articles and archived interviews. A trail of documentation that painted a picture of brilliance and tragedy, and with each new piece of information Elena felt something cold spreading through her chest. There was young Magnus giving interviews about pattern recognition and strategic thinking. Magnus playing simultaneous exhibitions against 50 opponents, Magnus accepting trophies while a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with dark curls watched from the audience, their faces glowing with pride. Then the tone shifted, news reports about a car accident outside Philadelphia, obituaries for Sarah Foster and Lily Foster, funeral footage showing a man so broken he could barely stand, holding himself upright through sheer force of will while they lowered his family into frozen ground. The final video was Magnus's retirement announcement. Delivered in a hotel conference room 3 weeks after the funeral, his voice flat and his eyes completely dead, saying he was stepping away from competitive chess indefinitely, thanking everyone for their support, asking for privacy, and Elena watched him walk away from the podium and understood with devastating clarity why he now mopped floors at night, why every chess move seemed to cost him something, why he'd buried himself in anonymity and repetitive labor that demanded nothing of his brilliance or his broken heart. Daniel was still talking, his words tumbling over themselves in his excitement. "I thought you should know in case he's some kind of corporate spy or trying to infiltrate the company. Maybe we should do a full security review. I can coordinate with HR and legal if you want." Elena looked up from the tablet, looked at this ambitious child who'd invaded someone's privacy and trauma for the chance at a promotion. and felt rage so pure it took her breath away. "You're fired," she said quietly. Daniel's smile froze, confusion replacing excitement. "What? Get out of my office, out of this building, out of my company. You're terminated, effective immediately for gross invasion of privacy and conduct unbecoming an employee of this organization. Security will escort you out, and you'll receive your final paycheck by mail." "But I thought—" "I was trying to help. I thought you'd want to know." She stood, her voice dropping to the cold, controlled tone that had made hardened executives weep. "You thought you'd be rewarded for digging into someone's personal tragedy and exposing it without their consent. You thought violating someone's privacy was a path to advancement. You were wrong. Now get out before I have you physically removed." Daniel left, his face white with shock, and Elena locked her door, sank into her chair, and spent the next 2 hours watching and re-watching the videos, piecing together the full picture of who James Carter had been before grief had dismantled him. She saw Magnus at 22 winning his first major tournament, at 25 getting married, at 30 holding his newborn daughter. The progression of a life filled with purpose and love and achievement, everything she'd never had, and then she watched it all get destroyed in a single moment on a Pennsylvania highway. Watched him try to continue at the funeral and fail, watched him walk away from everything he'd built, because what was chess compared to the people he'd lost? What were rankings and titles and the admiration of millions compared to Sarah's laugh or Lily's questions about cherry blossoms? Elena understood now why he'd disappeared, why he'd chosen work that required nothing but his body and time, why playing chess with her had been so difficult at first, each move a resurrection of skills he'd buried alongside his family. And she felt the weight of this knowledge settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. The private investigator's enhanced report sat in her inbox, unopened, suddenly irrelevant because Daniel had done the work for free, had handed her the secret James had been protecting, and now she faced an agonizing choice that kept her frozen in her chair as the afternoon light faded and her phone buzzed with messages she ignored. She could tell him she knew, lay his truth between them, like cards on a table, and see what happened. Risk destroying the fragile trust they'd built by admitting she'd been investigating him, that she now knew everything he'd run from. Or she could pretend ignorance, meet him Saturday mornings and continue their games and their careful conversations, carrying this knowledge alone like a stone in her chest, protecting his anonymity at the cost of the honesty she'd started to believe might be possible between them. Both choices felt like betrayal, revealing that she knew or pretending she didn't, and Elena sat in her darkening office watching the videos loop endlessly, young Magnus laughing with his daughter, the broken Magnus walking away from chess, ghost Magnus mopping her floors at midnight, and she had no idea which version of honesty would hurt him less, or whether some secrets were meant to stay buried even when uncovered, whether love, if that's what this was becoming, meant respecting someone's right to their own story, even when you'd been handed all the pages they'd tried to burn. Saturday arrived heavy with things unsaid. Elena walking into the cafeteria carrying the weight of knowledge she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to hold, and the moment James looked up from setting up the board, she knew he could sense something had changed, could see it in the way she avoided his eyes, in the tension radiating from her like heat from pavement in summer. They began without their usual exchange of greetings, Elena moving her first pawn with more force than necessary, the piece hitting the board with a sharp crack that made James pause mid-reach for his own response. She played aggressively from the opening, choosing sharp tactical lines instead of her usual strategic build-up, pushing pawns forward like soldiers sent to die, sacrificing position for immediate confrontation, and James met her aggression with quiet defense. His moves careful and measured, as if he was trying to gentle a wild animal that might bolt or bite. 20 moves in, Elena realized she was playing angry, trying to punish him for something that wasn't his fault, for making her care, for being someone other than who he'd claimed, for carrying tragedy so profound it made her own wounds feel shallow, and the anger was irrational and unfair, and she couldn't seem to stop it from pouring into every move she made. She pushed forward recklessly, ignoring basic principles her grandfather had taught her, and James defended patiently, building walls she crashed against like waves against breakwaters, and somewhere around move 30. She stopped seeing the board entirely, stopped calculating variations, stopped doing anything but feeling the question burning in her throat until it finally erupted midway through the middle game. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice too loud in the empty cafeteria, her hand frozen above a bishop she'd been about to move. "You could be anything, do anything. Why are you mopping floors and hiding and wasting everything you are?" The words hung between them like an accusation. And James went very still, his gray eyes searching her face for something she didn't know how to name. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and contained a certainty that felt like stone. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The response made her want to scream, want to throw the board and all its careful strategy across the room. Want to tell him she knew everything, knew about Magnus Foster and the championships and the family he'd lost and the life he'd abandoned. Want to shake him until he admitted he was running, hiding, choosing numbness over the possibility of living again. But she looked at his face, really looked at it, and saw beneath the careful control to the fragility underneath, saw how thin the ice was that he walked on every day, how much effort it took to simply exist, and the words died in her throat because she understood suddenly that knowing his story didn't give her the right to weaponize it, that some wounds were too deep to touch even with the best intentions. They returned to the game in silence, but something had broken in both of them. The careful distance they'd maintained now compromised, and their moves became hesitant, uncertain, neither willing to press the advantage when it appeared, neither able to deliver the final blow that would end the game in victory. The position drifted into a stalemate, neither king in check but neither able to move without walking into danger. A draw that felt like failure for them both. James began packing up the pieces with hands that trembled visibly, folding the worn wooden board with the care of someone handling something precious and breakable, and Elena watched his fingers shake and felt her heart break a little because she'd done this. Pushed too hard against walls built for survival rather than spite. What would it take? She asked softly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "For you to stop hiding?" He froze, the board half folded in his hands, and she saw emotions move across his face like storm clouds, pain and fear, and longing and something that might have been anger or might have been hope. He didn't answer, couldn't answer. Just finished folding the board and tucked it under his arm, and the silence between them felt like a living thing, expanding to fill all the space their words couldn't reach. Elena wanted to apologize, wanted to take back the question, wanted to tell him she understood more than he knew and less than she needed. But he was already walking away, his shoulders tight with tension, and she sat alone at the cafeteria table, watching him disappear into the hallway, wondering if she'd just destroyed the only real connection she'd managed to build in her entire carefully controlled life. The question hung between them for days, echoing through her thoughts during meetings and negotiations, following her home to the penthouse, where she paced at 3 in the morning, wondering if he'd show up next Saturday, or if she'd finally pushed too hard and he'd disappear again. This time, for good. She replayed the moment obsessively, analyzing her words like chess moves, seeing all the better responses she could have made, the gentle approaches that might have opened doors instead of slamming them shut, and she understood with devastating clarity that caring about someone meant having the power to hurt them, that vulnerability was a two-way street with no guardrails, that she'd spent so long protecting herself from pain. She'd forgotten that real connection required risk, required the possibility of loss, required being willing to break your own heart and someone else's in the pursuit of something true. Thursday night she saw him mopping the 40th floor, and they looked at each other across the expanse of marble and glass, and neither of them knew how to bridge the distance that had opened between them, how to return to the careful friendship they'd been building before she demanded more than he could give, before her question had exposed how much she needed him to be more than he was ready to be. And Elena went back to her office feeling lonelier than she'd felt in years, missing something she'd only just found and might have already lost forever. Magnus sat in his small apartment at 2 in the morning, the worn chessboard spread before him on a table scarred by years of use, and felt the past pressing against the present like tectonic plates grinding toward an earthquake he could no longer prevent. Playing again had awakened things he'd thought safely buried, memories rising from graves he'd dug with his own hands, and every Saturday morning with Elena was an excavation that left him raw and exposed and somehow more alive than he'd felt since the night everything ended. He remembered teaching Lily how the pieces moved, her small fingers barely able to grip the wooden knights as she asked endless questions in that bright, curious voice that had filled their home with light. "Why does the horsey jump over things, Daddy?" "Because knights are special, they can see paths others can't." She'd giggled at that, arranging her pieces in nonsensical patterns just to watch him pretend to be confused, and Sarah had laughed from the doorway, teasing him about taking a 4-year-old's chess game too seriously. And he'd pulled them both into a hug. His wife and his daughter, his entire world contained in that moment of ordinary joy he'd been too busy to fully appreciate. He remembered Sarah calling him in Moscow during the semifinals, her voice excited as she told him about Lily's school play, about the solo she'd gotten, about how proud she was, and he'd been distracted, focused on the position he was analyzing. His mind half on the conversation and half on the board. And he'd said, "Love you, see you soon," without really hearing her response, without knowing those would be the last words he'd ever say to her. The phone call had come 6 hours later. A police officer's careful voice explaining about black ice and a truck driver who couldn't stop and injuries incompatible with life, that clinical phrase that meant his family was gone, that everything he'd built his existence around had been erased in the time it took metal to crush metal on a Pennsylvania highway. He remembered the flight home, 18 hours that lasted forever. Sitting in first class and feeling nothing, his mind refusing to process what he'd been told, because accepting it would mean accepting that he'd been playing chess while they died, that he'd prioritized a game over being there, that his last real conversation with Sarah had been distracted and half-present. And now, he'd never get another chance. He remembered arriving too late. The bodies already at the morgue, having to identify them through photographs because he couldn't bear to see them cold and still, and he remembered the funeral where he'd stood frozen while people offered condolences that meant nothing, their words sliding off him like water off stone. But he also remembered joy, teaching Lily to ride a bike, Sarah falling asleep on his shoulder during movies, the three of them building blanket forts in the living room, simple moments of love and purpose and connection that had made everything else worthwhile. He remembered winning his first major tournament and looking into the audience to see Sarah beaming with pride, remembered Lily telling her kindergarten class that her daddy was a chess master and could beat anyone in the whole world. Remembered feeling like his life had meaning beyond the board, that success was measured in shared moments rather than ranking points. Elena had cracked something open inside him. This complicated woman who commanded boardrooms with the same strategic brilliance she brought to chess, who was as lonely as he was, but hadn't yet admitted it, who looked at him like he was a person rather than a ghost, like he still had value beyond his grief. He'd started watching her during the week, observing the way she moved through Hartwell Technologies like a general through a battlefield, brilliant and isolated, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone, and he saw in her a mirror of his own self-imposed exile. Two people who'd chosen safety over risk, numbness over the possibility of pain. Her question from Saturday haunted him. "What would it take for you to stop hiding?" The words cutting through his defenses because she'd seen what he'd been trying so hard to conceal, that he was hiding, that the janitor uniform and the changed name and the night shifts were all elaborate armor against a world that had hurt him too badly to face. He'd been angry at first, defensive. But alone in his apartment he admitted she was right, that he'd been running for 5 years, that Sarah and Lily wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted him to bury himself alongside them, to waste the life they'd loved him for living. Magnus pulled the chessboard closer, his hands shaking as he began setting up pieces in a familiar pattern. The position from his semifinal game in Moscow, the game he'd been analyzing when Sarah had called, the game he'd abandoned when he'd gotten the news and had never gone back to finish. For 5 years he'd avoided this position, couldn't look at it without hearing her voice on the phone, without feeling the ghost of that last distracted conversation. But now he found himself studying it with clear eyes, seeing that White had a forced win in 12 moves, a beautiful sequence he'd been close to finding before his world had shattered. He played through the winning line slowly, each move a small act of forgiveness, accepting that he'd been playing chess when they died. But that wasn't the same as causing their death, that loving chess hadn't made him a bad father or husband. That joy and tragedy could coexist without one canceling the other. Elena was asking him to move forward. This wounded woman who was learning to care despite every instinct telling her not to, who'd somehow seen through his disguise to the person underneath, and Magnus realized with something like terror that he wanted to stop hiding, wanted to live again, even though living meant risking the kind of pain he'd barely survived the first time. He thought about next Saturday, about whether he'd have the courage to show up or whether he'd run again, find another city and another name and another job that demanded nothing of his heart, and as dawn broke over Queens he was still sitting at the board. The position finally completed after 5 years. The game finally finished, and he understood that Elena's question hadn't been an attack but an invitation, a hand extended across the chasm of grief, asking if he was ready to climb back toward the light. And for the first time since that phone call in Moscow he thought maybe, impossibly, terrifyingly, he might be. The Hartwell Technologies annual charity gala transformed the building's lobby into something from a dream. Crystal chandeliers casting light across marble floors, ice sculptures melting slowly beside champagne fountains. 500 of the tech industry's most powerful people dressed in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, their jewelry worth more than most people earned in lifetimes. Elena moved through the crowd in a midnight blue gown that had cost more than a month of Magnus's salary. Her hair swept up, her smile perfect and empty, playing the role she'd perfected over years of these events, gracious and poised and utterly untouchable. A beautiful statue accepting compliments and making small talk that meant nothing. She spoke with venture capitalists about market trends, with philanthropists about the foundation's work funding STEM education for underprivileged children, with rival CEOs who pretended friendship while calculating how to destroy her. And through it all, she smiled and charmed and felt absolutely nothing, just the familiar hollowness of performing for people who saw her as a commodity rather than a person. Magnus worked the event as part of the expanded cleaning crew, invisible in his gray uniform among the sea of couture and diamonds, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces with the same methodical care he brought to everything. A ghost, moving through a party that existed in a different dimension from the one he inhabited. People brushed past him without seeing him, their conversations washing over him like meaningless noise. Discussing acquisitions and valuations and vacation homes in Aspen, their wealth so casual and assumed it had become boring to them. And he thought about how strange it was that 5 years ago he'd attended events like this, had worn the tuxedo and made the small talk, had been visible in ways that now seemed like a different life entirely. 2 hours into the gala, Elena felt the familiar panic rising in her chest, the sensation of drowning in a room full of air, surrounded by hundreds of people and completely alone, and she excused herself from a conversation with a hedge fund manager who was explaining why cryptocurrency was the future. Slipping through the crowd toward the balcony that overlooked the city, needing cold air and silence and space to remember how to breathe, she pushed through the glass doors and found Magnus there, taking out bags of trash to the service elevator, and for a moment they just stared at each other across the divide of their respective worlds, her in midnight blue and diamonds, him in gray polyester and work gloves, and something in his eyes told her he understood exactly what she was feeling, that he saw through the gown and the performance to the person underneath who was barely holding together. The party's noise filtered through the glass behind them. Muffled laughter and clinking glasses, and the string quartet playing something classical and forgettable. And Elena found herself speaking without planning to, her voice small and raw. "Dance with me." Magnus set down the trash bag carefully, his eyes searching her face. "There's no music. I don't care. Dance with me. Here. Now." He hesitated, and she could see him calculating the risk, the impropriety, the absolute insanity of a janitor dancing with a CEO on a balcony, while a charity gala happened 20 feet away. But then he pulled off his work gloves and stepped forward, and when he took her hand, his palm was warm and calloused, and somehow exactly right. They swayed together in silence. No music except the muffled sound of the party and the distant hum of the city 40 stories below. And for 3 minutes Elena let herself simply be held, let herself lean into another person's strength, let herself stop performing and just feel. And it was terrifying and perfect and more real than anything she'd experienced in years. Magnus held her carefully, as if she was something precious that might break, his hand steady on her waist. And she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, could smell soap and detergent and something uniquely him. And she thought about how strange it was that she'd never felt safer than she did right now, dancing with a janitor on a balcony while her world watched through glass. Inside, Daniel Park's replacement, a junior executive named Amanda, who'd been hired 3 weeks ago and was still trying to prove herself, noticed the CEO missing and went looking, found her on the balcony through the window, and without thinking about consequences or context, pulled out her phone and took a photograph, the image capturing Elena Hartwell in her expensive gown being held by a man in a janitor's uniform. The two of them swaying together in perfect stillness. And something about the intimacy of the moment, the way they looked at each other, made Amanda pause before deciding the photo was too good not to share. She posted it to her private social media with a caption about unexpected romance, tagged it with the company name, and went back to the party without realizing she'd just lit a fuse that would detonate both their lives. Magnus and Elena stayed on the balcony for another minute after the dance ended, neither wanting to break the spell, neither ready to return to their designated roles, and when they finally separated, his hand lingered on hers for just a moment too long. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said, and then he picked up the trash bag and disappeared back into the building, and Elena stood alone on the balcony, feeling like something fundamental had shifted, like she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross, like she'd finally stopped pretending and started living. And by morning, when the photograph had spread across social media and business news sites and gossip blogs, when her phone started ringing with angry board members and gleeful competitors and reporters smelling scandal, she would discover that some moments of truth cost more than you ever imagined, but were still worth every devastating consequence. Elena woke Sunday morning to her phone, exploding with notifications, hundreds of messages and calls flooding in before her eyes were fully open, and when she finally looked at the screen, her stomach dropped because the photo was everywhere. The image of her dancing with Magnus, spreading across social media like wildfire, each share adding new commentary, new mockery, new speculation about the CEO who'd been caught slumming with the help. The headlines were brutal by afternoon, business news sites running stories with titles like "Hartwell CEO's questionable judgment raises concerns," and "When corporate leaders forget professional boundaries," while social media exploded with memes and jokes, the photo edited and captioned 1,000 ways, each one reducing a private moment of genuine connection to entertainment for people who'd never risked anything real in their entire carefully curated lives. Her phone rang constantly, board members demanding explanations, shareholders questioning whether she was fit to lead, her lawyer asking if there was any legal liability, and her publicist trying to craft damage control statements. And through it all, Elena felt a strange calm, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life, for the carefully constructed image to finally crack and reveal what was underneath. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. 12 faces around the conference table ranging from concerned to furious. And Thomas Bradley, the chairman, led the charge with barely contained anger. "What were you thinking, Elena? Dancing with a janitor at a company event? Do you have any idea how this looks? It looks like I was dancing with someone I care about," she said quietly. "It looks like a CEO who's lost perspective," he snapped back. "The shareholders are panicking. Our stock price dropped 2% on speculation about your stability, and we need to contain this before it gets worse." While the board was crucifying Elena, Magnus was experiencing his own nightmare. Reporters camping outside his apartment building, shouting questions as he tried to leave for work, cameras flashing in his face, and it had taken less than 24 hours for someone to recognize him. For the research to spread, for his carefully guarded past to be dragged into the light he'd spent 5 years avoiding. By Monday afternoon, the headlines had shifted, chess websites and mainstream news picking up the story. Vanished chess legend found. Working as janitor. Magnus Foster. The grandmaster's fall from grace. Every article rehashing the accident, the funeral, his disappearance, his tragedy turned into content for people who'd forgotten about him 5 minutes after they finished reading. Reporters called his former colleagues, his old sponsors, anyone who'd known him before, building narratives about mental breakdown and wasted talent, and Magnus watched his privacy disintegrate in real time, the life he'd built from anonymity destroyed by a 3-minute dance he couldn't bring himself to regret. He stopped going to work Tuesday night, couldn't face the cameras and questions, couldn't bear being pursued and dissected and turned into a cautionary tale, and he felt the old panic rising, the urge to run, to find another city and another name, and another place where no one knew who he'd been or what he'd lost. Wednesday morning, the board gave Elena an ultimatum. Issue a statement, distancing yourself from this man. Call it a momentary lapse in judgment. Make it clear, there's no relationship, or we'll have no choice but to consider whether you're still the right person to lead this company. Elena sat in her office looking at the prepared statement her publicist had drafted, corporate language that would save her reputation by throwing Magnus to the wolves, by reducing what they'd shared to a mistake she'd correct, and she thought about the choice before her, the fortress she'd built versus the connection she'd found. Safety versus truth, and for the first time in her life, the decision felt easy. She scheduled a press conference for Thursday afternoon, stood before cameras and reporters in the Hartwell Technologies lobby, and delivered a statement her board hadn't approved and her lawyers had begged her not to make. James Carter is a person of extraordinary integrity, skill, and character, she said, her voice steady and clear. His occupation is irrelevant to his worth as a human being, and anyone who judges him based on what he does for a living rather than who he is reveals more about their own prejudices than about him. I respect him deeply, and I will not apologize for treating him with the dignity every person deserves, regardless of their position or circumstance. The reporters erupted with questions, asking if she was in a relationship with him, if this was appropriate for a CEO, if the board supported her statement, and Elena answered calmly that her personal life was her own, that she expected to be judged on her professional performance rather than who she spent time with, that Hartwell Technologies remained strong and profitable, and her leadership was unchanged. The statement intensified rather than calmed the scrutiny, her defiance becoming its own story. CEO refuses to back down despite board pressure. Elena Hartwell chooses janitor over corporate image, and her phone exploded again with angry board members and nervous shareholders and competitors. Smelled blood in the water. But buried in the avalanche of criticism were other messages, emails from employees saying they respected her courage, from women in business thanking her for refusing to bow to pressure, from strangers saying the photo had given them hope that authentic connection was still possible in a world of performance and pretense, and Elena realized that defending Magnus had cost her the fortress she'd built, but had given her something she'd never expected: the freedom to finally be herself, whatever the consequences, and the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting meant losing everything you'd spent your life constructing. Elena stood outside Magnus's apartment building Friday evening. The address pulled from his employment file in an act that would have gotten anyone else fired, and felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Past peeling paint and flickering hallway lights, into a world so far removed from her penthouse, it might as well have been another planet. She knocked on apartment 314, heard movement inside, knocked again harder when no one answered, and finally his voice came through the door, rough and weary. "Go away, Elena. I'm not leaving until you open this door," she said, loud enough that a neighbor's door cracked open down the hall. "We can do this privately, or we can do it where everyone can hear. But we're doing it." The lock turned and the door opened, and Magnus stood there looking like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted, and behind him she could see the apartment, small and sparse, and filled with half-packed boxes, suitcases open on the floor, a man preparing to disappear again. "You're running," she said, pushing past him into the room. "You're actually going to run again." He closed the door, his jaw tight with anger or pain or both. "What did you expect? You saw what's happening out there. The cameras and the questions and everyone digging into my life like it's their right to know. Like my grief is entertainment. I can't do this. I won't do this. I know who you are," Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know you're Magnus Foster. I know about the championships and the accident and everything you lost. I've known for weeks." His face went pale, then red, betrayal and fury warring in his expression. "You knew? You've been sitting across from me every Saturday knowing everything and you never said anything? You investigated me?" Her composure cracked. The careful control she'd maintained for so long finally shattering under the weight of everything she'd been carrying. "Yes, I investigated you, and I regret it. But I'm not sorry, I know, because it means I understand why you're running, why you think disappearing is the answer, and I'm here to tell you I'm not going to let you. You can't stop me," he said, his voice rising. "You can't possibly understand what it's like to lose everything that matters, to have your whole world ripped away while you were 7,000 miles away playing a game. Your loneliness and your trust issues and your Saturday morning chess games are nothing, Elena. Nothing compared to burying your wife and daughter and knowing you weren't there when they needed you most." The words hit her like a physical blow, but instead of retreating, she stepped forward, her own anger rising to meet his. "You're right," she said, her voice shaking. "I never had a family to lose because my father abandoned us when I was 16, used my mother's money to build his empire, and then disappeared with his secretary, leaving us with nothing. I watched my mother die 2 years later because her heart literally gave out from grief. And I spent the next 15 years building walls so high and thick that no one could ever hurt me like that again. I learned that everyone leaves, Magnus, that love is just another way to destroy yourself, and I've been alone ever since, because alone is safe, and safe is all I knew how to be." They stood in his shabby apartment, two broken people finally seeing each other completely, all the careful distance stripped away, and Magnus's anger collapsed inward, his face crumpling as something inside him finally gave way after 5 years of holding everything together through sheer force of will. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice breaking. "I was analyzing chess positions while they were dying. I was thinking about tournaments and rankings and strategy, and Sarah called to tell me about Lily's school play, and I was distracted, barely listening, and those were the last words I ever said to her. Love you, see you soon. And I didn't even really mean it, because I was thinking about chess. Always chess. And maybe if I'd been there, if I'd been home instead of in Moscow playing a stupid game." The tears came then, the first real tears he'd shed in 5 years, not the silent numbness of the funeral or the hollow grief of the years after, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, and Elena moved without thinking, crossing the space between them and pulling him close, holding him as he finally grieved, as 5 years of suppressed pain poured out in waves that left him gasping. She didn't try to fix it, didn't offer platitudes about time healing or them being in a better place. Didn't do anything but hold him and let him break, her own tears falling into his hair as she understood that this was what love looked like. Not the romantic fantasy of fixing someone's pain, but the harder truth of simply being present while they carried it. They sank to the floor together, Magnus's sobs gradually quieting into ragged breathing, Elena's arms still around him. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them, the last walls crumbling, the careful performance ending. Two people who'd spent years hiding, finally allowing themselves to be fully seen. "I'm so tired of running," he whispered against her shoulder. "I'm so tired of being alone." She whispered back. They stayed on the floor of his half-packed apartment as the light faded outside, holding each other like shipwreck survivors clinging to wreckage. And neither of them had any answers, any guarantees that this wouldn't end in more pain, more loss, more reasons to build new walls. But for the first time in longer than either could remember, they weren't facing the terrifying possibility of connection alone, and that small truth felt like enough to start from, like maybe the first move toward something neither of them had dared hope was still possible, the courage to try again despite every reason not to risk everything for the chance at something real. Magnus woke Saturday morning on Elena's couch, where he'd fallen asleep after they'd talked through the night. Sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a city he'd stopped seeing years ago, and felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident. A sense of purpose that went beyond simply surviving each day until the next one arrived. Elena was in the kitchen making coffee, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her perfect CEO facade completely gone, replaced by someone real and rumpled and more beautiful than any image she'd ever projected. And when she handed him a mug, their fingers touched, and he made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea if he'd fall or fly. "I want to play you one more game," he said. "The real challenge, the one you made at the gala months ago." Elena set down her coffee, her eyes searching his face. "Magnus, not for marriage," he continued, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Different stakes. If I win, you promise to stop hiding behind your company and your wealth, to let people in, to build a life that's about more than just work and proving your father wrong. If you win, I promise to stop hiding behind my grief, to come back to chess, to honor Sarah and Lily by actually living instead of just existing." She was quiet for a long moment, understanding the magnitude of what he was proposing. "When? Where?" "Next Saturday," he said. "Your lobby, public, open to all your employees. No more hiding for either of us. Let everyone watch. Let them judge. Let them see that we're done performing." Elena smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, fierce and scared and determined. "You're going to destroy me at chess." "Probably," he agreed. "But you'll keep your promise anyway." "Yes," she said. "I will." The news spread through Hartwell Technologies by Monday morning, employees buzzing about the public match, social media exploding with speculation, and when chess news sites picked up the story that Magnus Foster was coming out of retirement for one game, the interest went global. Forums filling with analysis and predictions, grandmasters offering commentary, streaming platforms requesting broadcast rights. Magnus spent the week doing something he'd avoided for 2 years, visiting the cemetery where Sarah and Lily were buried, standing at their graves with flowers in his hands and words in his throat that had been waiting 5 years to be spoken. "I'm sorry I disappeared," he said to the headstones that bore their names. "I'm sorry I stopped living because you couldn't. I thought staying frozen was honoring you, but I think maybe it was just cowardice, just fear of feeling anything because feeling meant remembering what I lost." He told them about Elena, about the chess games and the conversations, and the woman who'd somehow seen past his disguise to the person underneath. And he asked their forgiveness for wanting to move forward, for wanting to try again despite the guilt that whispered he didn't deserve happiness after failing to be there when they needed him most. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll always love you. That doesn't change. But I think maybe I can love you and still choose to live, still choose to honor what you gave me by not wasting what's left." He visited every day that week, talking to them about his fears and his hopes, about the game he'd play and what it meant. And by Friday evening, when he left the cemetery for the last time before Saturday's match, he felt lighter somehow, as if Sarah and Lily had heard him and given their blessing, as if the weight he'd been carrying had shifted from a burden that crushed him to a memory he could hold without being destroyed by it. Elena spent her week rearranging her life in ways that terrified and exhilarated her, calling her executive team together and announcing she was appointing a chief operating officer to share responsibilities and delegating authority she'd held with an iron grip, creating space in her schedule for things beyond quarterly reports and acquisition strategies. Her board was horrified, her CFO concerned. But Margaret, her assistant who'd watched her transform over the past months, smiled and said it was about time. Elena cleaned out her office of awards and accolades that meant nothing. They replaced them with photographs of her mother and grandfather. Small reminders that success without connection was just an expensive way to be lonely. She called the foundation that ran her charity programs and increased her involvement beyond just writing checks. started planning programs that would honor what Magnus had lost by helping children who'd lost parents, creating meaning from tragedy in ways that felt more important than any business deal she'd ever closed. By Friday night, sitting in her penthouse with a chessboard set up, reviewing games and positions she'd never be good enough to match, Elena realized that she'd already won in the ways that mattered, that whether she beat Magnus tomorrow or lost spectacularly, she'd finally stopped hiding, finally started building a life that was about more than proving she couldn't be hurt again. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Elena and Magnus meeting in the Hartwell Technologies lobby at 8, 2 hours before the scheduled match, and they stood together looking at the board set up in the center of the marble floor, surrounded by chairs for spectators who'd already started arriving, employees and press and chess enthusiasts who'd traveled to witness Magnus Foster's return. "You ready?" she asked, taking his hand. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." She squeezed his fingers, understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And together they waited for the crowd to gather, for the moment when they'd sit across from each other and play not just chess, but for their futures. Two broken people who'd finally found the strength to stop running, to face each other and themselves with complete honesty, to risk everything for the possibility of something neither had believed they deserved, the chance to begin again. The lobby of Hartwell Technologies had been transformed into something between a chess tournament and a media circus. 500 people packed into the space. Employees taking personal days to watch, journalists with cameras and microphones positioned at careful angles, and thousands more watching online as streaming platforms broadcast Magnus Foster's return to competitive chess after 5 years of silence. Elena sat on one side of the board in simple black, her usual armor of designer clothes abandoned for something that felt more like herself, while Magnus sat opposite in clothes borrowed from a colleague, neither of them dressed for performance but for truth. And when their eyes met across the wooden pieces they'd played with every Saturday for months, something passed between them that had nothing to do with chess, and everything to do with the promises they'd made, the walls they'd dismantled, the courage it took to be seen. The arbiter, a tournament director flown in from New York, started the clock, and Elena moved her first pawn with a hand that trembled slightly, the traditional opening she'd used 100 times. And Magnus responded with the same knight development he'd shown her in their very first game, and for 20 moves they played the theory they both knew, establishing position and developing pieces while the crowd watched in hushed anticipation. Then the game shifted, moved beyond preparation into the territory where creativity and intuition mattered more than memorization, and Elena felt herself being drawn into complications she could barely calculate, Magnus weaving patterns that were simultaneously aggressive and beautiful. Each move serving multiple purposes she had to untangle like knots in silk thread. But she'd spent months studying, learning not just chess theory but how Magnus thought, how he saw the board, and she found resources in her position she wouldn't have seen before, a counterplay that transformed defense into dynamic equality. And she watched surprise and something like pride flicker across his face as he realized she'd grown, that the student had learned from the master in ways that mattered. The crowd fell silent as the game deepened, even the journalists stopping their commentary, sensing they were witnessing something beyond competition. A conversation conducted through chess pieces, two people revealing themselves through the moves they chose and the moves they declined. Magnus could have pressed for advantage a dozen times, could have sacrificed material for attack, but each time he chose the move that respected her position, that acknowledged her defenses, playing not to crush but to engage, to draw out her best rather than exploit her weaknesses. Elena responded in kind, finding beauty in the positions they created together, combinations that pleased her aesthetically even when they didn't serve her practical chances. And somewhere around the third hour she realized neither of them was playing to win, not in the traditional sense, but to honor what they'd found in each other, to demonstrate through chess what they couldn't quite say in words. 4 hours in, with the board complex and tense, Magnus lifted his queen, the most powerful piece, and placed it on a square where Elena could capture it, a sacrifice so brilliant and unexpected that grandmasters watching online would debate its genius for years. because the move didn't lead to checkmate or material advantage but to something else entirely, a demonstration that sometimes you have to risk your most valuable piece, risk everything you have, to create the possibility of something beautiful. Elena stared at the offered queen, seeing the tactical continuation that would win her the game if she took it, but understanding the deeper meaning beneath the surface, Magnus telling her through chess that living required risk, that protecting yourself meant never truly connecting, that the queen had to be sacrificed not for victory, but for transformation. She had a path to win, could see the forced sequence that would leave Magnus's king exposed and helpless, could claim victory and extract his promise to return to chess, to stop hiding behind his grief, but as her hand hovered over the piece that would capture his queen, she saw a different move, one that would force a stalemate, that would leave neither of them winners in the traditional sense, but would honor what they'd built together, the understanding that some games weren't about winning and losing, but about finding someone who played with the same honesty, the same willingness to be vulnerable. She made the move that forced the draw, pushing her king to a square that gave Magnus no legal options, and the arbiter leaned forward to verify the position before announcing stalemate, neither player able to continue, the game ending in the rarest of results. A draw achieved not through exhaustion or failure, but through mutual agreement that winning mattered less than what they demonstrated together. The crowd erupted, some disappointed at the lack of decisive victory, but most recognizing they'd witnessed something unprecedented, 4 hours of chess played at the highest level, not as combat but as collaboration. Two masters showing each other respect through the universal language of 64 squares and 32 pieces. Magnus and Elena stood simultaneously, neither quite sure what came next. And then Elena was walking around the board, and Magnus was meeting her halfway, and they embraced publicly for the first time, not the careful dance on the balcony, but a real embrace, two people choosing connection over protection, vulnerability over safety. And the cameras captured it all. The CEO and the janitor, and the prodigy and the wounded, two broken people who'd found in each other the courage to try again. The applause continued as they held each other, and Magnus whispered against her hair, "We both won." And Elena whispered back, "We both lost." And they both smiled, because it was true. They'd each given up something, the safety of isolation, the protection of performance, but they'd gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore, that someone saw them completely and chose to stay anyway. That love, if that's what this was becoming, wasn't about winning or losing, but about finding someone brave enough to play the game honestly, to sacrifice their queen when the position demanded it, to risk everything for the possibility of something real. And as they finally separated and faced the crowd together, hand in hand, they understood that this was just the beginning, the first move in a game far more complex and terrifying and beautiful than any they'd played across a wooden board, the game of actually living, of building something together despite every reason to stay safe, of honoring the past by choosing the future, and neither of them knew how it would end, but for the first time in years, they were willing to find out. 6 months had passed since the game that ended in stalemate. 6 months of learning how to build something real rather than something safe. And Magnus stood in the bright, sunlit room of the Foster Hartwell Foundation's new community center in Brooklyn, watching 20 children aged 6 to 12 arrange chess pieces on boards donated by sponsors who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of something that mattered. He'd returned to competitive chess, but on terms that honored who he'd become rather than who he'd been, playing in smaller regional tournaments where the pressure was manageable and the joy was rediscoverable, teaching workshops, and giving simultaneous exhibitions where he could share what he knew rather than just accumulating victories. The foundation had been Elena's idea, proposed one Sunday morning over coffee as they'd discussed how to transform their story into something that helped others. And they'd named it for Lily and Sarah, creating programs that taught chess to underprivileged children, that provided grief counseling for families who'd lost loved ones, that proved something beautiful could grow from tragedy if you had the courage to plant seeds in broken ground. Magnus still worked at Hartwell Technologies, though his title had changed from custodian to director of corporate wellness, a position Elena had created over her board's objections, arguing that companies needed someone who understood that success without humanity was just expensive misery, and Magnus had built programs around mental health support and work-life balance that were slowly transforming the culture from the inside out. Elena had restructured her own life with the same determination she'd once brought to building her empire, appointing David Chen, her former CFO, as co-CEO to share the responsibilities that had consumed her for 15 years. And the board had fought her until the quarterly earnings came in stronger than ever, proving that a balanced leader made better decisions than an exhausted one. She spent her mornings at the foundation now, her afternoons at the company, her evenings with Magnus cooking dinner in the apartment they'd moved into together 3 months ago, a space that was neither his sparse room nor her sterile penthouse, but something new they were building together, filled with chessboards and photographs, and the comfortable mess of 2 lives intertwining. They were together but taking it slowly, learning to trust that this was real, that neither would disappear or betray or abandon, unlearning years of defense mechanisms that whispered everyone leaves, proving through daily presence that some people stay even when staying is hard, even when old wounds ache, even when fear suggests running would be easier than risking your heart again. They still played chess every Saturday morning, the ritual that had started everything. But now the games happened in the Foundation's center, often interrupted by children asking questions or requesting help with their own games. And Magnus had discovered that being interrupted by curious young voices didn't trigger pain anymore, but something closer to healing, each child a reminder that life continued, that teaching and connection mattered more than protecting yourself from feeling. This particular Saturday, a 7-year-old girl named Maya with dark curls that reminded Magnus achingly of Lily had asked him to show her how the knight moved, why it jumped over other pieces when nothing else could. And Magnus knelt beside her board, arranging pieces in a familiar pattern. "The knight is special," he said, his voice gentle, "because it sees paths that other pieces miss. It doesn't move in straight lines like everyone else. It moves in an L shape. And that unusual path means it can jump over obstacles that would stop other pieces." Maya studied the board seriously, her small fingers tracing the knight's possible moves. "So it's like being creative? Like finding a different way when the normal way is blocked?" Magnus felt his throat tighten with emotion, remembering Lily asking similar questions, seeing in this child's curiosity the same bright intelligence his daughter had possessed. And instead of the crushing grief that had defined him for 5 years, he felt gratitude for having known that love, for being able to honor it by passing it forward. "Exactly like that," he said. "Sometimes the best moves are the ones that don't look like everyone else's moves." Elena watched from across the room, leaning against the doorway with a cup of coffee and a smile that transformed her face from the severe CEO mask she'd worn for years into something softer and more genuine. And she thought about how strange and perfect it was that a drunken challenge and a series of Saturday morning chess games had led to this. To a life she'd never imagined wanting, to love she'd convinced herself she didn't deserve. She understood now that love wasn't about filling the void left by loss, wasn't about finding someone to complete you, or fix you, or make you forget the pain you'd carried, but about having the courage to open your heart again despite every reason not to. About choosing vulnerability over safety. About building something new rather than trying to resurrect something old. Magnus caught her eye across the room and smiled. And she smiled back. And in that simple exchange was everything they'd learned together. That some risks were worth taking, that hiding protected you from pain but also from joy. That second chances were rare and precious and required the kind of bravery that looked nothing like the corporate fearlessness she'd once mistaken for strength. The Foundation's walls were covered with photographs now. Children learning chess, families healing together, Magnus and Elena at tournament exhibitions and fundraising galas, a visual record of what happened when 2 broken people decided to stop running and start building. And as Magnus returned to teaching Maya about knight forks and discovered checks, as Elena joined them and knelt beside the board, offering her own insights. As the room filled with the sound of children laughing and pieces clicking and life continuing despite everything that tried to stop it, The scene captured something essential about human resilience, about the power of authentic connection, about recognizing that every person we meet carries hidden depths and private griefs, and the potential for extraordinary courage if we're willing to see past the surfaces we present to the world. And now, dear friends, as we reach the end of this story, I want to speak to you directly, to step out from behind the narrative and acknowledge that you've been here with us through every move, every sacrifice, every moment of choice between safety and risk. This story of Elena and Magnus isn't just about chess or grief or corporate drama. It's about something we all face, the question of whether we'll let our wounds define us, or whether we'll find the courage to open our hearts again despite every reason to keep them closed. We've all been betrayed. We've all lost something or someone that mattered. We've all built walls to protect ourselves from further pain. And this story is a reminder that while those walls keep out hurt, they also keep out connection, joy, love, all the things that make life worth living beyond simple survival. So I invite you to consider where you might be hiding, what walls you've built, what risks you've avoided, and whether today might be the day you make a different move, take a different path, choose vulnerability over protection, and see what beauty might be waiting on the other side. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and authentic connection is worth fighting for, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity, our capacity for resilience, and the extraordinary courage it takes to simply keep playing the game, keep making moves, keep opening our hearts even when we're terrified they'll be broken again. Because that courage, that willingness to try, is what makes us fully human, fully alive, and fully worthy of the love we've convinced ourselves we don't deserve.